I was born in Kingston, Ontario, not Kingston, Nova Scotia. Not a doctor, because my father was a well-known and successful doctor, and I thought I'd be a lawyer. Like salmon swimming back upstream, Kingston, Queens, and then for a more, even in those days, more diverse and experience, York University, Toronto. Surprise, political studies. That's a very interesting story. I started, first real job out of university was working on the Hill for a couple of opposition MPs, which by the way is a lot more fun than working for a government MP, I would say, or even for a minister. Opposition's a ton of fun. And then spent a bit of time in the private sector and got drawn into the provincial public service in Ontario. And then for family reasons moved back to Ottawa and joined the federal government for 12 months, and I stayed for 30 years. PM, maybe 4, maybe 5, in the Office of Federal-provincial Relations. Left PCO in the great Campbell reorganization of 1993, went to Health Canada and was an ES6, and kind of went back and forth, referendum, a couple of other things, and was then recruited back by André Junot and Guy Bourgeot to be Director of Federal-provincial Relations. First ADM job was the reference group of ministers on Aboriginal policy in PCO. I had been at PCO as a DG in Intergovernmental Affairs. Cathy O'Hara was supporting Minister Dion's reference group established by Prime Minister Chrétien. Well, it's a black box, but I think it's less of a black box than we like to make it out to be. There isn't a formal application process, but I do think, and this is a view I have more broadly, we have more control over our destinies than we sometimes think we do. And so you can, in different ways, put your hand up. The usual procedure, you get a phone call from senior personnel. You get summoned in to ask. Very clear, no promises, no guarantees. They're really just seeing if you're willing to put your hat in the ring. And there are a few conversations, or questions and back and forth, and then you were thanked for your time and sent cheerfully on your way, and then you wait. And then there's a phone call from the clerk, usually. First was associate at Natural Resources Canada with Cassie Doyle as deputy for the most part, and then briefly with Serge Dupont. Ton of fun. Then CBSA, executive vice president with Luc Portelance. 2 more different people you probably could not find, which maybe there was a reason for that. They put us together. But we spent 3.5 years together and we're a great team. He was a great leader. Then Deputy Minister of International Development at Global Affairs. Key role there, one of the big points was it was part of the the previous government's effort to consolidate the department. So it was rolling ex-CEDA into the department. Then briefly, the senior advisor for the Syrian refugee initiative. And then my last role was, for over 3 years, as the Deputy Minister of Public Safety. It's complicated. It, I think, requires an awful lot of ongoing care and feeding. In some ways, I think federalism is the glue that holds the country together, but we've been blessed or cursed by a relatively stable decade or two, actually. So we've tended not to pay as much attention, I think, take it for granted. I struggle with, do we want to live in the interesting times of the 80s and 90s and 2000s, mid-2000s, up to the mid-2000s, or are we better off in the seemingly relatively tranquil period? But I think we are headed towards choppier waters from a federalism perspective. So I was there until a few months before the actual referendum. And to be honest, and this is relatively, I was quite junior, I was ES6, I wasn't in an executive rank. I was frustrated, and so that's when I moved to Health Canada. But in that frustration, I think, is an answer to the question around what it was like. There is no question there was a real sense that for the first half, and in the lead up to the referendum, many people thought that this was a slam dunk for the Federalists. And then the emergence of Lucien Bouchard, the leadership of the campaign for the yes side, was transitioned informally, and then more formally from Parizeau to Bouchard. And he was a myth in the making. It was impossible to respond to. We spent a lot of time in the lead up to the referendum struggling with how to come up with a more emotional, more emotionally attractive rationale for voting no. And I think in the end, that was a strategic vulnerability. Now, there's also happenstance and blind luck, and the very compelling story of Bouchard's near death, his loss of a leg, and then his pilgrimage through the province in the latter days of the referendum. But I think we made our lives more difficult by not having that compelling emotional connection, and I think that's still a challenge for Federalists and federalism in the country. To be frank, I would say on waivers. We all go through periods in our career when, leadership changes, things change. And so I left Health Canada, and Andre Junot and George Anderson recruited me, found me a landing spot, to be frank. And it was a fascinating time because it was in the really very beginning of thinking through the clarity agenda with Stéphane Dion, and it was a fascinating period, very controversial internally within the government, but also controversial internally within PCO and Intergovernmental Affairs. There were a lot of very strongly held divergent views, and it was fascinating watching that initiative work its way through the system. It really started, I would say, ironically, and not in a place where people think security is a significant issue, but in reality it is quite important, at an immigration, where we started to deal with things like visa policy and security certificates and issues of essentially who gets in and who doesn't get into the country. Fast forward several years, the decision to match up a security person at CBSA, Luc Bourdelance, who'd spent all of his career at CSIS, was someone who had at least some affinity for that, but had a more varied social policy, intergovernmental, and a little bit of security background. And that's where that sort of came together. But even today, I think of myself more as a generalist than as a security person. And I think the security community in the federal government is strengthened when it draws people in from other sectors, as opposed to being viewed as kind of a silo and you work your way up. And I think, like most sectors, you benefit from a mix of real expertise, but also broader experience bases. It goes back to the decision of the clerk of the time, Janice Charette, that she wanted to present to the new government, which had, through this campaign, had bid up. It started at 5,000, then 10, 50, it was like an auction, bid up the number of refugees by Christmas. She wanted to present to the government in the transition period between the election and the swearing in of the government a whole of government perspective on the refugee issue. And she, as a former deputy of immigration, knew that it was, yes, immigration and refugees, in those days CIC. Yes, it was the border agency, but it was also international development, because refugees come from somewhere, and almost always they transition through third countries, and there's a lot of international aid. And so she asked me to, does clerk ever ask, suggested that I be part of transition briefings for the new government. Not surprisingly, it mostly focused on my colleagues in immigration and at CBSA, Lizotte McPherson and Anita Biggis. So I was able to sort of observe, and it's no secret that the transition advice and the government generally, the public service as a whole, was a little reticent about responding to, about how to respond to this initiative. And so I said to the clerk, this is the government's highest priority. You need to appoint someone to take a central role to lift some pressure off line deputies who are developing relationships with new ministers that they're going to have to maintain, and there's going to be some good news and some bad news in the middle of these conversations. And I certainly wouldn't want to be trying to run the initiative while also onboarding a new minister and all the things that are associated with that. So the clerk took that advice and came back a little while later and said, within a few days, and said, yes, I think that's sensible advice. I said, that's great, who have you selected? And she said, you're doing it. I said, no, I really like my role at International Development. It's a great job. I've just been there 15 months. I'm really getting my head around the job. And she said, well, that's very interesting, but the Prime Minister's already approved the order in council, and it's going to be issued in 48 hours, so buckle up. So that's the story of how I got drawn into the Syrian Refugee Initiative. We got 25,000 people, refugees from Syria, into Canada. The government changed its deadline from Christmas to the end of February. Happily, it was a leap year, so we had an extra day, and I remember saying that to ministers, and they laughed. I said, no, this may come down to the final plane load on the final day. We got this done not because of anything I did, to be frank, in the Syrian as a special advisor, but by heroic work by people in CBSA, CIC, Global Affairs, Defense, heroic work by community groups across the country. It was really an extraordinary collective effort. It is, but I don't think it has to be. And one of the phrases I really dislike is never waste a good crisis. There are people who are going through the crisis, and we shouldn't get to that point to be responsive and innovative and break some china. Leaders can, in a constructive way and in a positive way, impart urgency and a willingness to take risks and do things differently outside of the limelight. So lots of people don't know about it, but things get done. It's certainly easy in a crisis to motivate people. So it requires a different set of muscles and competencies by leaders to drive that kind of change when the platform's not burning. I saw, as I worked my way through the public service, good leaders and not good leaders. And I frankly saw it till the last day I left. For me, it was trying to emulate those things that good leaders, I thought, would do. Doing the right thing, not taking the easy decision, but making the right decision, sharing responsibility, not abdicating it. It's a hard question, but it's really simple when you think about it. And at the end of the day, it's simple things like, can you look at yourself in the mirror and say, did I this week or today make things a little bit better? Or sometimes even, did I not make them worse? And some days we're going to say we made them worse. But being honest with yourself and with your colleagues and your subordinates is authentic. Being a good leader, I think, is also someone who's authentic. My approach to leadership was to mimic the people I thought were good leaders. In many ways, they're unrecognizable. 1990 and 2019, unrecognizable. In other ways, they're exactly the same institutions. There were always these border clashes between the political level and the bureaucratic level. They existed in the 90s when I joined. For a variety of reasons, I heard stories in the 70s and the 60s, the 70s and the 80s about the same issues. So I think part of it we need to understand is it's not an entirely brave new world, but it's also not exactly the way it was 20 or 30 years ago. It's a long game, and by game I don't mean manipulative. I mean it in the sense of it's a long process. Public service in particular is a place where you can at times in your career very early have very significant impact. I was in the public service, federal public service, less than 2 years, year and a half, and I was right place, right time, writing notes for First Minister's meetings on the economy for the Prime Minister. And that Prime Minister read them because we saw the underlying things. That's kind of cool. Other jobs afterwards, I was lucky if I got to do correspondence because I hadn't proven myself. I'd say to myself, it's easy to get frustrated and to want to have impact all the time and immediately. And I think one of the challenges, but one of the unique things is that as you work your way through the organization, and that doesn't necessarily mean up, but as you deepen your knowledge and expertise, you may decide that you want to stay focused in a particular subject area. The breadth and scope of the influence you can have in the public service rivals anything you can have in any other occupation. And so I think it's about understanding, and it's not for everybody, but understanding that if you really want to have profound impact, positive impact on the lives of Canadians, there's no better place to work. I will preface this by saying I think we don't use the time as associate deputy minister as well as we should. Maybe it was because Cassie Doyle was my first deputy, but she essentially said to me, I think in almost these words, but certainly this spirit, this will be the last time you get to fill your intellectual competency basket. So absorb, learn, observe. When you make the transition to being a deputy and running things, there's only one deputy, and it doesn't matter how many associates there are, what the structure is, it's you. And so it can be a very isolating experience. And so one lesson is to understand that point. It is different. These roles are profoundly different than any other role you will have in public service. Secondly, despite the fact about isolation that I just talked about, you're not alone. There are at any given time 30 or 40 other colleagues who are going through exactly the same thing. And some are further down the road than you are. And some of them, not all of them, will be quite happy to share their experiences, be sources of advice. Certainly my experience, I reached out to a handful to seek advice when I had particularly challenging circumstances. Another piece of advice is that there can develop a bit of a cult of the personality around deputies. You sometimes don't even know that it's happening. Sometimes you do, and it strokes your ego. I think there's risk there. I think deputies need to find the right balance between occupying space, being leaders, but also recognizing that everyone is watching absolutely everything you do, and will take a side glance to a comment as that's an instruction. And this was a challenge for me because I had a tendency, and still do, to make smart aleck comments, and would have to make it very clear I was joking. Like, that wasn't an instruction. And I think understanding the performative nature of the role is really important. And I think the final piece of advice I would have for someone is you have to be authentic and genuine and support your teams. And not the team you import, the team you inherit. You have to learn about them and make the best of them. So I could go on at great length, but those are 4 or 5 sort of key elements I think are really important for a new deputy. We've not talked a lot about having fun. These can be serious jobs. I spent time in the security space in my last stint, 3 years, and it can be a dark and gloomy place, but you've got to find ways to have fun, make things interesting. It can't just be doing heavy lifting all the time. You've got to find ways to bring groups, teams along, and if nobody's laughing, it's not going to last very long.